Yadi Shabdafayam Jyotira Samsarana Dipyate. Which means, if all three worlds are not lit by the light called language, then all these three worlds would remain in dark. With these meaningful words from the Sanskrit poet Dandi's literature, I begin this online symposium on literature and mental health hosted by Indian Psychiatric Society. Sometimes the right words can supply us with the inspiration and strength we desperately need. And let's be honest, inspiration and strength are two vital ingredients for anyone considering positive mental health and mental health recovery. They give us a push we need to become our best selves. A warm welcome to all of you who have graced this symposium with their presence with a sheer love towards literature. Let me have the pleasure of inviting past president of Indian Psychiatric Society, our task force advisor, himself a theatre personality and the curator of this symposium, Dr. Ajit Bhide, to welcome the dignitaries. Dr. Ajit Bhide, sir.
Thank you, Shubrata. Thank you for that very poetic beginning, the right way to start, I would think. I remember when we had our preliminary meeting, our president, Dr. Vinay Kumar, had strongly urged that we should conclude with a poem. You have started with a poem, which augurs well. Dr. Vinay Kumar has also been very kind to us to say that literature cannot be confined by the scientific boundaries of punctuality and so forth. So with good respect to Indian sliding time, we have started a few minutes late. It gives me great pleasure to invite Dr. Vinay Kumar and my dear go-to person, Professor R. Raguram, to chair today's session. It's indeed a great honor for me that both of you promptly accepted my request that both of you chair today's session. Now, we initiated the task force thanks to the interaction I had with Vinay. He was trying to persuade me to take some other portfolios, but I stuck to literature and mental health, which was also very, very dear to him. And we had some starting trouble, mainly because I had run into bad health for a few months. But here we are, we've taken off. The one I missed today, really missed today, is the poet, scholar, Dr. Anand Nadkarni. Anand is a gifted man with letters, and we hope to have him participate in these programs. I am mentioning him today because he's supposed to be the chair of this particular task force, but he's a very busy man, continuously on the move, and he's at another function today, so he told us to go ahead with today's program. Shubrata has already dilated upon the importance of words, the importance of literature, and what it can, its relevance to mental health. But to fully understand the impact of literature on mental health, I have my dear friend, Prabhachandra. Thanks, Prabha, for accepting my invitation like this. I felt there was a little nervousness, but then you quickly accepted our invitation, and thank you for doing that. Today's topic is a little, today's webinar is a little varied fare. We've taken three topics, not quite at random, but important topics in my opinion. Discussed them with Dr. Vinay Kumar before we got this going. And I have my friend, Dr. Kaushik Chatterjee, if you could remove your burqa and become visible to us. AVM, Dr. Kaushik Chatterjee, another good friend who promptly accepted my request to be part of today's session to speak on grief, mental health, and literature. Such an important, huge aspect of life, and its impact on literature and literature's impact on grief are very important facets that we will be covering today. Finally, and not to get stuck with pathologies like grief, we have something about positivity, and Dr. Vinay Kumar suggested the eminent Hindi poetess and a professor of English, Dr. Anamika from Delhi, to speak about inducing and enhancing positive mental health. So these are our speakers today. Thanks to the chairpersons and the speakers one more time for being here. Thanks also to my fellow members of the task force. I mentioned Anand, then there is Dr. Raguram, who is the co-chair, and Dr. T M Raghuram. There are two Raghus here today, not to be confused. A poet in his own right, a much awarded poet, I must say, and Shubrata, who also ventures into writing quite often. I noticed that a large number of psychiatrists, very becomingly, are poetic in their thought, poetic also in their writing. And we will have more interaction about that. In future, Vinay has come up with the idea that we should have a focused session on different illnesses, starting with schizophrenia, where we'll have two presenters. My apology is for the fact that the rich literature that we have in the vernacular, we cannot adequately communicate. Something gets lost in translation very often. I understand Kaushik will be making good this loss to some extent, but we have to have a common medium of interaction, and that will be English, at least for the time being, for all our sessions in literature and mental health. The term of the present office bearers of IPS is coming to an end, and I would urge the future office bearers to continue this particular venture of bringing together two important facets of our life, literature and mental health. In future, we hope to have sessions also focused on different languages. We may take 3 languages at a time and have somebody address issues on mental health related that emanate in that particular language. Without much ado, may I invite my friends and chairpersons, Dr. Raguram and Dr. Vinay Kumar, to take over today's proceedings. Over to you, Raghu and Vinay.
Sir, before that, thank you, Dr. Ajit Bhide, sir, for the kind welcome. And he has been there from the beginning to even today morning, he has been reminding me to what all needs to be done. So before we hand over it to the chairpersons, I would like to invite our co-chairperson, Dr. Raguram TM, who himself is an eminent psychiatrist, a poet and a flautist, to introduce our chairpersons, Dr. Raguram and Dr. Vinay Kumar, sir. I'll just share a screen, sir. 1 second. Yes, sir, you can. Sir, you can start.
Yeah. Thank you, Shubrata. First of all, let me thank our dynamic Dr. Ajit Bhide and ever-smiling Shubrata for being instrumental in organizing this, and also for giving me a chance to introduce our eminent chairpersons. So it's my pleasant privilege to, first of all, introduce Dr. R. Raguram. I have known him from my MBBS days in JIPMA. He was my senior, a mentor, and a very close friend. And we continue to be close friends. He's a retired professor of psychiatry from NIMHANS, currently still practicing in Bangalore. He's a well-known teacher, researcher, and a very good speaker. And his special interests are in cultural anthropology and psychiatry, narrative approaches in psychotherapy. And from his student days itself, he had a keen interest in the arts, literature, music, visual arts. He was a very good artist, photographer, a nature enthusiast, and a bird watcher. He continues his bird watching now, and his writings on various topics under the sun in his very eminent blog. Today's seminar on the interface between literature. There's some disturbance. Interface between literature, humanities, arts, and the human mind and mental health. And he's the apt person, chairperson, to start off the proceedings. I'm proud to present Dr. R. Raguram, who lives in Bangalore. And next, it's my pleasant privilege to introduce Dr. Vinay Kumar, who is a very illustrious person, currently the president of the Indian Psychiatric Society, and ever smiling. Again, it's very I'm very happy to see that all people on this seminar are smiling from the beginning itself. So it's a good sign, and especially to have a person at the top of our association as a smiling president, a very good indicator. He's the South Asia zonal representative of the World Psychiatric Association, and he has held various administrative positions as General Secretary, Treasurer of IPS, Secretary of Suicidology Specialty Section of the World Association for Social Psychiatry, and he was the past chairperson of the Election Commission of Indian Psychiatric Society, a member of Specialty Board of NBE. Presently, he is a consultant psychiatrist at Patna. He is the editor and co-editor of various textbooks, like the textbook of UG Psychiatry and other textbooks which you will see here on the slide, Interfaces of Psychiatry, Spectrums of Psychiatry, and Suicide, etc. And other than psychiatry, he's well known as a prose writer and poet. He has published 2 books of prose on mental health and 5 books of poetry. And he has received awards from the IMA, the Ramchandra Murthy Award in 2007, and the Hindi Literary Award is the Ayodhya Prasad Khatri Award in 2014. So with these few words, let me proudly introduce our IPS President and co-chair and chairperson, Dr. Vinay Kumar. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Raghu, for your warm recollections. It took me back into our days in Jibma when we started the campus newsletter and magazine, and you were along with me in that initiative. Let me start on a personal note. I hail from a background, a literary background. My mother was a writer and a fairly well-known translator, recipient of the Sahitya Akademi Award. I grew up listening to her stories, as well as interacting numerous writers who used to drop in and participate in discussions. When I look back, all those interactions, all those stories have shaped my orientation in life in very significant ways. It has made me aware of myself. It has extended that awareness to understand others more effectively. And I would add that that exposure to literature quite early in life probably also played a very significant role in my choice of psychiatry as a professional career. There is the interface between literature and mental health and illness is an area that can offer us tremendous insights about the functioning of human mind in health and illness. On this background, I find this initiative taken by the task force to address this area through lectures by 3 eminent speakers extremely appropriate and interesting. Over to Vinay for his comments before we go on to the speakers.
Very good morning. Thank you, Raguram sir, for introducing the concept in a very lucid language. The birth of literature and psychiatry task force was not possible without my interest in this, because it was not in the field of psychiatry, especially in IPS. All of us usually we talk of science. But what happened, I could recollect long ago, I was wandering in the cyberspace like a lonely cloud. And suddenly I met John Stuart Mill, where he was narrating his personal experience that his father was a kind of philosopher, utilitarian philosopher. And he was very interactive with all utilitarian philosophers of the time. And a very ambitious man. He wanted to see his son as a person who knows everything, who can do everything in the field of philosophy, literature, sociology, and everything. And that young boy was fed with lots of stories, lots of information in the teenage. And he was made like a kind of bullet who can pierce any intellectual debate. So what happened at the age of 17, 18, he realized that philosophy of utilitarianism, which tells us that justice is most important thing in the society. Then he realized that if justice is done to everybody, will it be possible to make everybody happy? If the justice is linked with happiness, then he was, then he felt that no, probably not. And it was a time he was feeling very sad, and a kind of melancholy was gripping him, and gradually he became depressed. But he was intellectual, he was sharp, and he was analyzing himself. So he recollected that when father sent him for a sabbatical to go to France, and that sabbatical was also to learn something from somebody there. And in France, he realized that the beauty of nature was kind of a therapeutic thing for him. Then he came back and started reading Wordsworth. And Wordsworth poetry did a wonder to him. He recovered from depression. And probably for me, this was first anecdote that poetry can treat somebody. Then I would like to, so this reminded me of famous Hindi poet Suryakant Tripathi Nirala, who lost his daughter. And you can think, somebody loses his daughter, what happens to him? He was deeply depressed. And he treated himself by writing Saroj Smriti. Unique thing. If you go through it, it makes you tearful. It's a kind of catharsis. But definitely with a kind of epic sensibility and includes lots of things. Then it reminded me, Mirza Ghalib, famous Urdu poet, was having family history of schizophrenia. His brother was schizophrenic. And his life was such, the kind of person he was, what he opted for his life, the way of life he opted, only writing and writing and writing, no compromises in his life, that made his life miserable. And there was a time he was deeply depressed. And then he wrote, Koi umeed bar nahi aati, koi surat nazar nahi aati, kawa kis muh se jaoge khali, sharm tumko magar nahi aati, maut ka ek din muayyan hai, neend ki raat bhar nahi aati. If you go through this ghazal, all couplets are about depression, low mood, hopelessness, helplessness, worthlessness, talking about death, guilt, all features of depression. But what did he treated himself by writing, by catharsis, and by doing this. And fourth example comes to my mind is Swadesh Deepak. Swadesh Deepak was a famous Hindi writer, and he was the kind of diagnosis we can give him is schizoaffective disorder, in which elements of schizophrenia and mood disorders both were present. Famous playwright, famous story writer, and 7 years in his life was full of psychotic episodes. He tried to commit suicide. He was admitted in PGI Chandigarh, and he has narrated Maine Mandu Nahi Dekha, unique book in which he narrated his whole journey of illness. And this book was available in Hindi, Maine Mandu Nahi Dekha, but recently Zeri Pinto has translated into English. Somebody has told me, I have not seen the book. So it's unique. So all these things came to my mind. Then I thought, bibliotherapy, which we know little, is a thing. Now it's time to think IPS to form this kind of section which can talk about this link and this society which is becoming illiterate in the sense of literature. Gradually, the kind of design, political design is such that they will make you literature by illiterate. So in this situation, it's time that we must take some initiative. So with these few words, I hand over to Prof. Raguram sir again to conclude the session.
Thank you, Vinay, for that lovely introduction to the topic and your initiative to start this movement in the Indian Psychiatric Society. The first speaker today is Dr. Prabhachandra, whom I have known for over probably 3 decades. She has had a very stellar career. Look at the number of publications that she has, the commitment she has to the area in which she is passionately involved. Beyond all that, I have found her to have an abiding interest in all art, forms of art, including literature. So it is very appropriate that she talks about the interface between literature and mental health. That said, literature has a transformative power on ruptured realities. In psychiatry, we deal with ruptured realities. One of the greatest examples for me is Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. It's a very bleak novel, not an easy read. And the characters are not the ones that you fall in love with. He details the lives of a murderer, an alcoholic, and a shrew of a wife. But as you read through the novel, you get into the characters and start seeing them in a different light and start being even sympathetic to what they are facing in their life. So literature can open up doors in which we can have a glimpse of the working of the mind, as I mentioned earlier, both in health as well as illness. To take us further into this arena, let us hand over the thing to Dr. Prabha. Dr. Prabha.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Raguram and Dr. Vinay, Ajit and Shubrata for giving me this wonderful opportunity. I quite agree with Ajit that when he initially asked me, there was a little bit of, hesitation, but that was just very, very momentary. When he called me up and asked me to talk about this topic, very fortuitously, I was reading this book. And in Zoom, it goes the other way around. But it's a book called How Proust Can Change Your Life. This is a book by somebody who's very well known, Alain de Botton, who started the School for Life. And Marcel Proust was an author who probably wrote one of the longest novels. It is 7 volumes long, and it's very aptly called In Search of Lost Time. Now, very few people actually dare to read this book because it's so long. In fact, Virginia Woolf read this book and then said she will stop writing because it was excellent. Marcel Proust himself was a hypochondriac, probably had chronic depression, never got out of the house, did not get married, and had a very boring life, but wrote a very rich novel. And as I was reading this book about how Marcel Proust can change your life, it was all about how a novel can actually influence so many aspects of your life. And so it was very interesting that Dr. Ajit Bhide called me at that particular time. I'll now share my screen to go to my presentation. Can people see my presentation? I'll go into slideshow.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I have also taken the speaker's privilege of showing you different books of mine in different parts of my house, because very often I'm in the kitchen and that's where I read a lot of my books. And so this is my kitchen bookshelf. And as the presentation goes, you'll see different bookshelves of mine in different parts of my house. I think these words of a French philosopher, which says, I've never known any trouble that an hour's reading didn't assuage, is really very apt, both for me and for many of the people I see. For me, books have been my best friend, my therapist, my gurus, and I have needed no other because of books, right since I was a child. I think the best thing that I keep telling my father, what he did for me was to introduce me to libraries. And my favorite outing used to be libraries. because in that world, you would get lost in literature and even as a child understand, that there were so many things that you would get from books. I must also mention at this stage that I have been helped a great deal in this presentation and conversations about literature by a patient of mine, Ujjwala Nagendra, who's, who comes to me. I learn from her as much as she learns from me. She's a student of literature, and she has suggested many things about this topic, and I'm really grateful to her for that. So the outline of my talk is going to be how literature improves mental health, books as prescription, some personal examples of how I've used books in the recent past, and a little bit about psychiatrists and literature. I'll try to complete in about 20 to 25 minutes so that we have some time for discussion. So Virginia Woolf really aptly said this: when we read, we are in perpetual union with another. And I think that is one thing which books do. And all the research in this area, all the people who prescribe bibliotherapy have talked about one major aspect that literature does, and it's enhancing empathy. Enhancing empathy towards people with mental health problems, but among people with mental health problems, being more empathic about oneself, about one's own experience, as well as understanding why people don't get them. So I think in every way it increases empathy. In fact, books have been used to enhance empathy in children as well. There are experiments of using books and literature in prisons to enhance empathy among people who've committed crimes, who are known to actually have low levels of empathy. Books also provide hope and inspiration for recovery. And I think that for us as mental health professionals, that's something very important, because quite often there are things that you can't tell a person. You can't, assuage their anxieties, whether they'll get better or not. But books do provide an hope and inspiration. And finally, of course, they facilitate a much, much better understanding of yourself and others. So the book that I'm reading currently, How Proust Can Change Your Life, talks about something called the finger placing ability. And it's really interesting. And this happens to all of us who read literature. That is to put a finger on perceptions in books that we recognize as our own, yet could not formulate on our own. Many of us don't have the words to describe emotions. It's so hard, and especially sometimes in vernacular, and in a language that could vividly express what we really feel. We may say, oh, we feel sad, or we feel low, or we feel anxious, but an author can actually describe it in such great detail, using so many metaphors, similes, nature, that we often get this feeling of aha, this is exactly what I meant. And I think that's something which literature provides, and to many of us and to many of the people whom we help. Literature also, makes our mind to become like a radar. It somehow increases the sensitivity. It somehow increases our ability to pick up things in our environment. After you read a book, when you talk to somebody, or you're taking a walk, or you're in the midst of nature, any of that, you realize that you suddenly become more attuned to pick up certain objects floating through your own consciousness or in your environment, which you might otherwise not be very attuned to. So I think it's these words, which are not my words, they are the words of the author, actually really vividly describe how reading can change one's ability to relate and to empathize, as well as to become much, much more aware of one's own feelings. So looking at the world through the eyes of another character that you identify with provides the reader with a different way of looking at the same problem that is now shared. So if you are terribly anxious, if you're grieving, if you're low, just looking at it through the eyes of another character provides you with a completely different way of looking at it. It's the same problem, it's now shared. And very often the sense of loneliness that one might feel is eliminated through this connection with text. Identification, of course, leads to empathy, and then the reader undergoes a catharsis. And this is also the principle of what we will talk about later, what the president talked about, which is called bibliotherapy. So what is bibliotherapy? And this is something that the chairperson and I, Professor Raguram and I discussed, that might be something that we can talk about and discuss. So bibliotherapy is basically a form of art therapy that focuses on leveraging the power of stories and books and literature to heal. Bibliotherapy, of course, does not limit itself to literature. It's also self-help and other forms of narratives. But in this context, we're talking about literature. So its power lies in the relationship that is formed between the reader and the writing. This may be narrative, poetry, or essay, and the reflection of the thoughts, feelings, observations, and the lessons that the writing provokes. So it's a relationship between the reader and the writer. It also is a reflection of thoughts, feelings, observations that come to your mind. And through a daily journaling session, a bibliotherapy workbook, or through a session with a mental health professional or a bibliotherapist, you use this form as therapeutic. So bibliotherapy is a specific form of therapy. This is something which is so interesting, and I hope I'm going to get this book very soon. It's called 1,000 Books for the Hospital Library. It was in World War II that hospital libraries started as a way of healing those who were, who were affected by the war. And the Menninger Clinic was the first to start, using books as therapy. It was Edith Kathleen Jones who first started this whole exercise of collating books for various mental health conditions, more often mental health, less often physical health. But can you imagine, in 1913, she collected 1,000 books for the hospital library, each one for a different condition. And she mentioned that it was a guide towards, this whole book was a guide towards a selection of wholesome, readable literature for those who are ill, either physically or mentally, while it has been compiled with the requirements of the latter class of patients in mind. Mind you, 1913, focusing on mental health and literature. It would seem no less suitable for the former. And we've seen this, that very often literature talks about illness, talks about physical problems, pain, be it physical or mental. And so this was probably the beginning of using books or literature for therapy, for having an impact on mental health. So what are the three main pillars of bibliotherapy? The three main pillars are connection, which we just heard about, that you connect with the writer, you connect with the words, you try to understand, you relate to it. It's also safety, that you trust the words that the author is writing. You feel safe then to explore feelings that the book evokes in you with somebody else. You're curious, you're open, you're hopeful. When you're connected, your defenses are relaxed, you're able to acknowledge feelings. The feelings validate you. I think that's such an important aspect of literature, and I'll show you some examples of that later, about how your feelings get so validated that suddenly you think, this is exactly how I'm feeling. It enables self-awareness, and very often there's a cathartic release of pent-up emotions. I mean, how many of us have not laughed out aloud when reading something which was meaningful, or teared up when reading something else, or become pensive and thoughtful? So it's a cathartic release of pent-up emotions. And then, of course, there is action, where you're open to change and possibilities. You formulate an action plan and you improve your attention span and concentration. So I think one must kind of keep all these in mind, and I will describe them a little later. This is a very interesting book which I have currently ordered, which is called The Novel Cure. It's basically novels. It's a play on words. It's an A to Z of literary remedies. So A starts with, for example, abandonment, and it ends with Z, different conditions from A to Z. And now it has an Indian edition, where you have an Indian author called Indrajit Hazra, who's collaborated with Ella Barthoud and Susan Elderkin, who are from the UK. And you have From Abandonment to Zestlessness, 751 books to cure what ails you. And sometimes their cures are novels that offer solace and a portrayal of a character in a similar predicament. Sometimes there are novel solutions, which reflect a model to which the reader should look up to. And sometimes novels provide just the opposite, the characters you most definitely don't want to resemble. And we all know that. We read a book and we often identify with one character, and the other character really becomes the opposite of who we want. So in any book that we have read, and all of us have our favorite books, we know that there are characters with whom we identify so strongly. And if I would ask people, tell us one character that in all the books you have read, you could identify with, all of us would have, identified with that one person. So what is the right book-client fit? And I think this is again very important. So as mental health professionals, when we want to, focus on the right book-client fit, we really need to keep a lot of things in mind, because it's one thing to read something for yourself, but when you're prescribing a book, when you're talking about a book to somebody, it's extremely important to be mindful of so many issues. I somehow don't like the word prescribing a book, because it seems so sort of mechanical, because those of us who like literature or write know that we just get completely engrossed. But as mental health professionals, if we are thinking of the right book, as you can see, I have a lot of Joseph Heller's in my shelf. I like his paradox. I like his play of words. And then if you look at another book that I have, which is Indulekha, which is one of the oldest Malayalam books. And the reason I bought it once in Cochin was because I wanted to understand women in the Malayali community, in the Nair community, and how the matrilineal culture grew, just to understand the women I see today from that community who come to me for help, to get some idea of the intergenerational issues that they might be working with. So I think it's very important for us also to constantly keep abreast. But coming back to the right book-client fit, I think very often we learn from clinical trial and error, but there has to be, you have to think of the therapeutic context. You need to think of the person, the patient who's coming to you, their needs and situation, their developmental level, their language, and what stage of therapy they are in. It may not be possible to give somebody a book very early on before you have a safe relationship or a rapport with them. So I think it's important to kind of think of which book you want to share with your patient. Somebody like Freud actually talked about how valuable storytellers were as allies, and their testimony is to be rated high, for they usually know many things between heaven and earth that are not yet dreamt of in our philosophy. So it is often, bibliotherapy is often used as an addition to psychotherapy, even though it can be used by itself. And when I was reading, I came upon a lot of other words. Sorry for that spelling error, biblioprophylaxis, that is, you give books to prevent things from happening. And we're going to probably listen to a little bit of that from Madam Anamika, who will tell us a little bit about how poetry can improve well-being. Bibliodiagnosis, books can act as projective techniques, things that you don't know about people. They may read a book and tell you something about, I felt like this, and this is what I've been wanting to tell you. And then, of course, you have literatherapy, which basically uses literature as an addition to psychotherapy, which was what probably Sigmund Freud was talking about. Now, does bibliotherapy work? Ujjwala, who worked with me on this presentation, gave me this article, which were 5 studies evaluating the impact on mental health and mood of recalling, reading, and discussing fiction. And what it said was something very interesting, that reading fiction per se, by itself, may not necessarily change your mood. But if fiction is to be leveraged for therapeutic value, I quote from the article, then it cannot be operationalized as a type of cultural pharmacy, or worse, as a cultic object that cures through mere exposure. And I think all of us should remember that a little bit, that it needs to be supported by an infrastructure that systematically and patiently encourages readers to evaluate the experiences by way of reflection and discussion. And which basically means that even the psychiatrist or the psychotherapist also needs to have that level of reflection and the ability to discuss a book. So I think it's not enough to just say, oh, go read this book, but to be also, be aware that it requires a certain level of reflection after that happens. Indeed, when I was reading this article, I was wondering whether there was any negative impact on mental health of literature. And I would be very happy to hear this, some of it in the discussion. But I think that if somebody is not prepared, somebody gets overwhelmed, you don't have an opportunity to discuss, then sometimes literature, if perceived not appropriately, can be a little disturbing as well. Now to some books that I have used in my therapeutic work. This was a book called The Sad Book. Michael Rosen is a very well-known UK poet. He's very simple and very, very, writes very meaningful books. And this is an animated book that he has developed. This is himself. And I use this with people who are depressed because, and this was sent to me, interestingly, by a friend of mine who was going through depression and said that he was somebody with a very high level of intellect, and said that he didn't have the opportunity or the time to go to a therapist. And so he used bibliotherapy. And he then sent this book to me saying, I'm done with it. It helped me. Now it may help somebody else. And so if you look at this little caricature and the words, this is me being sad. Maybe you think I'm being happy in this picture. Really, I'm being sad, but pretending I'm being happy. I'm doing this because I think people won't like me if I look sad. And I think this is something that so many of our patients say, that I don't want to be depressed. I'm depressed about being depressed. I'm guilty about being depressed. I'm putting so much burden on people around me. This is such a common refrain that we get. And something like this, to be able to identify with an author or a writer can actually, it gives us the language we need to speak to ourselves and to each other with a ring of truth, but not the harshness of it. And in this little words with a little graphic, who and where is sad? Who is sad? Sad is anyone, comes along and finds you. So, it's not your fault that you're sad. Where is sad? Sad is anywhere. It comes along and finds you. So it can happen to a mom, it can happen to a young girl. And I think words like this can actually be very therapeutic to somebody who's going through immense sadness and hasn't still found a meaning about it. Now, literature when the healer needs healing. I need to tell you the story. A dear friend of mine who's also a mental health writer, his name is Tanmoy Goswami, and he's agreed for me to talk about him. He has a website. He writes about mental health quite a lot, himself a user of services. He was struggling and I was trying to talk to him. And I realized that I was not getting through to him on a lot of things, and he was very disturbed. I could see it in his writing. I could see it in his tweets that he was not doing okay. And then I found this book. I had read it long back, and this is by somebody called Linda Gask, who herself is a psychiatrist in the UK, works in the NHS. And she wrote this book called Finding True North. Basically, it was the healing power of place and how where you live may make a lot of difference to how you feel. And so she was in this busy, North UK clinic, and she moved completely to a very isolated, coastal area, which is where she actually found peace and got over her depression and sadness. And I sent this book to Tanmoy, who then decided to move from Delhi to Ooty to find his peace, and feels that he did the best. This was the best thing he could do. I don't think that we would have thought of any of this as therapists or doctors. We would have never prescribed it. But a book actually changed his way of looking at things and his way of life. So I think sometimes this was to me a great example of how literature can make so much difference to people, and how we can use it for ourselves and for others. This is a book which I think I really recommend to a lot of people with schizophrenia and to family members. It's a biography, so it's not truly literature, but it's written beautifully by Ellen Sachs. I had the privilege of meeting Ellen Sachs. She is a professor of law and psychiatry at, I think, in UCLA. And she is somebody who survived schizophrenia. And she beautifully describes hallucinations, disorganization. And I often use it for my students to kind of make them understand what really it means to hear voices. Because we as psychiatrists never ever really understand what it means to have hallucinations. And in this particular quote, she says, explaining what I've come to call disorganization is a different challenge altogether. Consciousness gradually loses its coherence. One's center gives way. The center cannot hold. The me becomes a haze, and the solid center from which one experiences reality breaks up like a bad radio signal. Such a beautiful, evocative way of describing what happens to the self in schizophrenia. And I don't think that, you know, without reading this, I would have not understood what disorganization really means. So I think these are ways in which people can understand, what happens to people with psychosis. I come to poetry for mental health, something which Professor Anamika and Professor Raguram talk a lot about, and Dr. Vinay. And I specifically want to talk about haiku poetry as metaphor, which I use quite a lot. And this one is, of course, from Basho Matsuo. I've added a picture because I realized that Professor Raguram, in his daily gyan that he gives us so beautifully curated and done, had actually talked about it a few months ago. I think it was in June, where he talked about Basho Matsuo. And this was the picture he had. But I have used these three haiku poetry as metaphor and many others. For example, if it's somebody who wants to be like others and who feels they're very different, I will often use this. Don't imitate me. It's as boring as the two halves of a melon. And people who are different, who are neurodiverse, or who find themselves different, actually learn to sort of accept it. The oak tree, not interested in cherry blossoms. So some people who are like very solid and dependable, not interested in other things, find it very hard to accept themselves. And this is a good metaphor for that. And somebody to whom you want to talk about mindfulness or the transitoriness of experience, how admirable to see lightning and not think life is speaking. So these are words that you can actually, these are metaphors, and there are many, many others that you can actually use as very small, simple ways of getting people to think. I'm sure in many other languages, these are available as ways in which you can, without being very directive, make people think. I found this amazing initiative, and I'm hoping the IPS will take this on. It's called Poems in the Waiting Room. So in several places in New Zealand, in the UK, in Ireland, they actually have, for patients who are in the waiting room, poems. So when you're sitting, you don't read some old magazine that is available there or look at your phone, but you actually read poetry. And here's a patient who's expressed her gratitude. And there are so many such testimonials about how this helps in dealing with these cards, help in dealing with worry and anxiety, and how they bring some warm light, darkness. So I think small things like this can actually make a lot of difference, and they are yours to keep, so you can take them away. Margaret Atwood is somebody that we've all read. Her wonderful book. She's a favorite author of mine. But I have used this poem with some of my young patients because they're often told, you're sad because you're sad. It's psychic. It's the age. You're an adolescent, no? It's chemical. Go see a shrink or take a pill or hug your sadness like an eyeless doll. You need to sleep. Well, all children are sad, but some get over it. Count your blessings, they tell the girl. Better than that, buy a hat, buy a coat or pet. Take up dancing to forget. Now, how many young people have not been told this? But then you say, forget what? Your sadness, your shadow, whatever it was that was done to you the day of the lawn party, when you came inside, flushed with the sun, your mouth sulky with sugar, in your new dress with the ribbon and the ice cream smear, and said to yourself in the bathroom, I am not the favorite child. Now, this is something that so many of my young patients and adults have identified with, saying, yes, this is exactly how I felt. And I think there are so many of these available to use, to communicate, to relate to young people. I want to, quote my colleague, Professor Santosh Chaturvedi, who has written this wonderful article on Madhushala by Harivansh Rai Bachchan. In discussions with him in the past, he himself is a poet, and he often talked about Madhushala not being about alcohol, because Harivansh Rai Bachchan himself was a teetotaler. And then he wrote this article, which is available for people to read in this journal, and how the poem actually has different meaning for each of his readers, which talks about love, beauty, pain, sorrow, and death, and heavily loaded with multiple interpretations, metaphors, and symbolism, and how this poetry has many lessons and gyan for mental health and well-being, death and dying, pain and suffering, and relationship. And as a psychiatrist, he's read this poetry book many times, interpreted it differently each and every time. So I think that, many of us may not have written about it like he has, but have used several pieces of literature and poetry in therapy. So why psychiatrists should read literature? These are my last few slides. One is, very often if somebody is in a psychiatric hospital, doctors don't seem to, as psychiatrists, we often become very clinical, have the delusions come down, have the hallucinations come down, is she sleeping well? Whereas, this is a poem by somebody who was in a psychiatric hospital who said, observe the hours which seem to stand between these beds and pause until a shriek breaks through the time to show that humankind is suffering still. Very evocative about how people feel in a ward setting. I also want to introduce you to Professor Femi Oyebode. Professor Femi Oyebode, whose website address I will give you in the end, is a poet and a psychiatrist, works in the UK, has a wonderful website called Mind Readings, has written several books of poetry. And he, every month he writes something. And this was sometime last year where he talked about Alejandra Pizarnik, who is an Argentinian poet who talked about, she's called the poet of mists and shadows. And what I want you to focus on, where she says, oh dear old Sigmund Freud, psychoanalytic science forgot its key somewhere. To open its wound, it opens, but how to close the wounds? The soul suffers without relief, without piety, and the evil doctors do not staunch the festering wound. There are lots of literature for children as well. Yes, Dr. Raguram, I'm finishing in 1 minute. Yeah. And I would urge people to choose books for mental health for children as well. And these are available in Indian literature. Libraries are a great nurturing and healing space. Karnataka, for example, has so many libraries. There's an initiative to create more rural libraries. And I think this is a very good opportunity for IPS to actually collaborate and use literature in impacting mental health. These are bibliotherapy sessions available. This is something which I found and can be used. And finally, I just want to show you a few websites which can be looked at. And of course, also that of Professor Raguram, a wonderful website for those of us who want to use the arts and literature for ourselves and for therapy. And finally, ending with, we need to know we are not alone. We read because we are alone. We read and we are not alone, and we are not alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabha, for that wonderful, insightful overview of about the role of bibliotherapy. It was quite insightful, as I mentioned earlier. The topic is now open for discussion. Any further contributions, clarifications are most welcome.
So there are 1 or 2 questions in the box, chat box, if you can take it up. By Ashok Kumar.
That was not...
So do depression have energy and enthusiasm to read?
Can you read it aloud?
Yeah, it is by Dr. Ashok Kumar. Do depressive patients with persons with depression have energy and enthusiasm to read? There's also a comment later about the same thing, that it's pretty common for mental illnesses to affect one's ability to read. Same person.
Thank you for that. And I think it's so important that, that is why it's important that bibliotherapy be chosen carefully. That somebody who's extremely retarded, who can't read, and if you thrust a book in his or her hand, she's not going to respond to it. So I think it's important for us to remember that we're not talking about somebody who's severely depressed, but I have found that reading is a less cumbersome activity than, when you tell them go out and take a walk. Sometimes they may not be able to do it. Sometimes reading together, reading just one page at a time and then reflecting. So there are ways in which you can tailor whatever you're doing with the person based on their ability. Yeah.
One more question. One more comment. For clients from rural areas in our society, prescription to read comics and storybooks will work positively, by Dr. K S Shubrata.
Okay,
just because somebody's from a rural area, I found some people from rural areas reading quite a lot, particularly in vernacular. And so I think it's more about people with low literacy and trying to use different methods, including more graphics to work with them. And second is people with learning disabilities. There is a comment in the chat box about that. I think fortunately we now have audiobooks available. I'm also quite partial sometimes to audiobooks when I don't have the time. So that might also be a good way of actually, using this. Completely agree that, language and literacy may be an issue, and that's something that we can get over by using other methods, especially with technology, to try and see what we can do to overcome that barrier and make literature go to the masses. Yeah.
Dr. Kishore has raised a question. Madam, kindly elaborate on the negative effects of bibliotherapy also.
Yeah. Thank you. I did allude to it that, if it's not rightly prescribed, or if it's too premature, or if it's not reflected on, it can't be a pharmacy. It's not a pill by itself, but it needs to be something that you can reflect on together. And if it's too early, if it's too overwhelming, because many times you have people saying, oh, read this book, this is great, it helped me, it may help you, but it's not necessarily so. So I think it's important to remember that we need to be responsible when we prescribe something.
On this issue further, Dr. Jaya raised a question. Is there any type of book which is a contraindication in certain conditions?
I know that we're going to talk about grief later, because I think that is one of the most overwhelming conditions that people may prematurely prescribe something for. But I also think that, books on, let's say, suicide or sexual abuse, many times it can actually trigger to use the more lay word, trigger, but it can actually create an environment of a lot of emotional turmoil. And if not done in a safe manner, if not done with a lot of support, it can actually, create problems. So I think as psychiatrists, as therapists, it's our responsibility to first read the book, see what we can prescribe and what we cannot.
Parvati Krishnan raises an issue. I feel language and literacy are privileges which are enjoyed by many, but still forbidden fruit to some, at least in India.
Yeah, I think I read that and I responded to that we need to find ways in which, we can, reach the unreached, particularly using more maybe simple ways of talking about literature. I do want to emphasize that, for example, in Karnataka, one of the IAS officers has started this whole movement of rural libraries, and they have a scheme where, I mean, not a scheme really, but they encourage children. So take a book home to your mother is one method that they have found. So the child chooses a book for their mother and reads it with the mother. So I think these are some, unique and innovative ways in which even one can work with people with low literacy. You can read out a book in a group and work with that. So there are ways in which all of us need to think of innovative ways to do this.
Dr. Tarika Sandhu, on observation seeking your comment, ma'am. Digital media content, especially short reels and videos, are reducing the attention span required for reading. So those who are digitally dependent would need greater efforts to benefit from bibliotherapy.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's a challenge. Those of us who are from the era of reading books to get our daily sustenance also are, getting drawn towards these rapid methods. But I was talking to a bookshop owner, independent bookshop owner the other day about this topic. And they told me that, interestingly, a lot of young people have started reading and come for these joint book readings to create a community. So I think we need to think of different ways in which we can get younger people to engage. May not be so much isolated solo reading, but maybe reading in groups. I also see a lot of young people having their Instagram feeds about books they read. So I think creating those kind of ways in which, people can create a community around reading so that it doesn't necessarily become a isolated activity.
Let me pay attention to two raised hands, one from Raghu, other one from Ajit.
And one more, sir, Dr. Sai Kumar, I think.
Yeah, and then we will go on to the next.
You decide, sir.
Yeah. Ajit, you would like to say something?
Yeah, thanks. I thought you were going to give it to Raghu, but I had a number of things to say, but I'll cut it short. Just one comment about it, sort of, thank you for the comprehensive presentation, Prabha. The impact that literature can have on public thinking is so immense. Three examples come to mind. One is Mein Kampf by Hitler. It moved the German public so solidly behind the Nazis and into the prejudices that Hitler had. On the other hand, on the positive side, we have the work of Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Lincoln was astonished to learn that it was not his oratory that had an effect on turning minds against slavery, but this little book had a profound effect, especially among women and young children. And if you change them, then the men sometimes are forced to change. Finally, closer home, Savarkar's work on the mutiny of 1857, which he taught us to think of as the first fight for the first freedom, war of freedom. I think I was surprised to learn that it had a huge effect in Tirunelveli. A professor of Tamil translated that Marathi work from its English translation into Tamil. And that had a huge effect around there to get people into the patriotic mode.
Raghu? You have to unmute.
I'm working in a small town, and a lot of patients come from the villages. And I find that there are people in many families who have a streak of or a flair for writing, and sometimes they make feeble attempts and they're discouraged by the family. Such people, sometimes they bring their material and show during consultation. I have written a poem or I have written a story. So I listen to them, I read that or get back to them. So all these things encourage them to write further. And sometimes it reduces their tension and they are able to connect. That is one. And some of them have published books later on and gifted me also. That's one. The second point is that I have a shelf in the consulting room where I keep some general books. poetry, essays, and other things, other than medical books in the shelf. So patients who are interested in that, when they come and see that shelf, they ask me, do you also read? Can I borrow that book of stories? Then I give them, and they come for the next follow-up, they give it back and then talk a few words about that. So this sort of interaction helps them in their pathology also. I just wanted to say that.
Right. Before
Excellent.
we move on to the next speaker, two observations and comments from me. The first thing is Prabha mentioned about the use of library. Nimhans Hospital was perhaps the only mental health institution which had a library within its premises. And many times patients used to go there, read. I don't know whether any other hospital has a library within its premises. Secondly, use of literature to increase sensitivity to human experiences among psychiatric trainees. During my tenure in Nimhans, we used to have what was called as a brainstorming session on Saturdays at 12 o'clock, in which students can bring in any kind of books, novels, poetry, and then the discussions used to spin around that. What we noticed was that this kind of exercise really helped them to attune themselves to listen to the patient more attentively and be more sensitive to the kind of travails that they face in their life. On to the next speaker now. May I request the speakers to just stick to the time limit of 25 minutes, please.
Sorry.
Dr. Kaushik.
Sir?
Dr. Kaushik's PPT.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So introduction first.
Dr. Kaushik has a very interesting background. He's a serving officer. He's an Air Vice Marshal and a medical officer in the Eastern Air Command. He was earlier professor and head of the Department of Psychiatry at AFMC Pune and a lead consultant, that's very interesting, to Institute of Aerospace on Gagayan, the human space flight program, principal investigator in Manas. More than anything else, he mentions research interests as mathematical modeling, addiction medicine, and medical education. And he ends up by saying actual interests are literature, history, quizzing, and travel. Dr. Kaushik is going to address a very, very interesting arena as to what is the impact of literature in the grief process. What kind of role that it can play in terms of addressing and resolving grief. As you are aware, grief is a very complex process, and various interventions are in place in terms of various grief therapy outlooks. So books, can there be of any value? Can there be of any role in terms of addressing the suffering of people going through grief? On to Kaushik sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raguram. Greetings from Shllong, where the cherry blossoms alluded to earlier are abloom and the waterfalls are in spate. It's really very beautiful. Let me take you straight to Dylan Thomas. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old rage should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. If you thought this was about anticipatory grief, about the impending death of his father, you're in the company of Seamus Heaney, the Nobel laureate Irish playwright. He goes on to say, and you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. This poem has moved so many people. George R.R. Martin wrote this sci-fi novel called Dying of the Light. This poem has been recited in Back to School, the movie, in Independence Day. Also, in Interstellar, and it moved another poet so much that he changed his name from Robert Zimmerman to Bob Dylan. He has sung, and I recite, when you're lonely and you haven't got a friend, just remember that death is not the end. His songs have given solace to so many who are grieving. When you're standing on the crossroads that you cannot comprehend, just remember that death is not the end. And there is no one there to comfort you with a helping hand to lend. Just remember that death is not the end. All that happens with grief, the pain, the open wound, memory, sadness, loneliness, the endless silence, despair, erasure of memories, and finally acceptance. Much of this was felt by the Prince of Denmark. One moment in love, the next out of love, angry, ready for revenge, then procrastinating, gloomy, melancholy, then wise, again bitter, sarcastic, rude, unsure. It is so difficult for the readers to define Hamlet. Adrift, his father had died not long before. That was all. Now he was lost, lonely, grieving, hence not very rational, not easy to understand. He even saw the ghost of his dead father. Shakespeare, that keen observer of human nature and all its frailties, had seen the dramatic possibilities of grief. And what of Ophelia? She cannot come to terms with the death of her father Polonius, compounded by Hamlet's rude behavior and neglect. She loses her grasp on reality and then she drowns herself. Is grief gendered here? Or did that master observer document pathological grief as all psychiatrists know it? Oh yes, here it is Laurence Olivier and Vivian Leigh in that masterly rendition. Tagore wrote in Jibon Smriti, or My Reminiscences, after Kadambari Devi, his favorite sister-in-law, confidant and muse, committed suicide, leaving him bereft. The acquaintance with death in my 24th year was a permanent one, merging its pain with the grief of every successive bereavement that has continued to weave a long garland of tears. I was unaware till then of the slightest lack in my life. There were no holes in its tightly woven fabric of laughter and joy. And then death suddenly arrived. In a single moment, it tore to shreds that very visible fabric of my life. How bewildered, how lost I felt. And 18 years later, when Mrinalini Devi, his wife, died, he wrote very soon after that, Ache dukkho, ache mrittu, biroho dohono lage. My translation is inadequate here. It does not capture the lyrical pathos that is in the original Bengali. But if you listen to Hemant Kumar or Lopamudra Mitra's songs, you will hear about there is sorrow, there is death, tormenting anguish of separation burns. In its midst, there is still peace and bliss as the eternal universe turns. And flows the ceaseless stream of life, the sun, the moon, the stars, they glint. Spring returns to my garden with magical hues and striking tint. As one wave ebbs, the other gears to rise. Flowers wilt, new buds they blossom. When there is no decay, where there is no decay, no end nor bound, that divine whole my mind seeks soon. Sometime later he goes on to say not in grief that she is no more, but say with thanks that she was. Acceptance. J.D. Salinger's Holden Caulfield says, I slept in the garage the night he died. and I broke all the goddamn windows with my fist just for the hell of it. It was a very stupid thing to do, I'll admit, but I hardly didn't even know I was doing it. And you didn't know Ali. He's a teenager, Holden, and Ali, 2 years younger, dies, his brother. And he says you would have liked Ali. He was 50 times smarter than I am. And towards the end of the book, he goes on to say to his little sister Phoebe, I'm standing on the edge of some crazy cliff. What I have to do, I have to catch everybody if they start to go over the cliff. I mean, if they are running and they don't look where they are going, I have to come out of somewhere and catch them. That's all I'd do all day. I'd just be the catcher in the rye and all. He wants to prevent them from experiencing the pain of grief. He wants to prevent that loss of innocence of childhood. Auden, he talks about the all-pervasiveness of grief. He was my north, my south, my east and west, my working week, my Sunday rest, my noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that life would last forever. I was wrong. That retired robber Ratnakar, who became the anthill mendicant Valmiki, saw the hunter's arrow kill one of a pair of amorous mating cranes, and the other of the pair died immediately of grief. In his own grief, he cried out, Ma Nishad, and the first shloka, or the beginning of literature, emerged from shoka, or grief. So grief lends itself to literature. The oldest known piece of literature, 5,000 years old, quoted so beautifully in the British Journal of Psychiatry last year. Listen to this. Gilgamesh began to rage like a lion. He paced around the bed, tore out his hair. He dragged off his splendid robes and flung them down as though they were abominations. 5,000 years of recorded literature, and grief hasn't changed all that much. 7 days and nights I sat beside the body, weeping for Enkidu, and then I saw a worm fall out of his nose. Must I die too? Must Gilgamesh be like that? Literature and grief makes us question ourselves, the frailty, the feebleness of our lives in this universe. Onwards to the Egyptians. Isis, the daughter of sun god Ra, and the sky god Nut, married Osiris, the chosen one. But Seth was jealous. So he killed Osiris, chopped up his body into 14 pieces and flung them over the 14 regions of Egypt. Isis was heartbroken. Her laments rent the sky, and the sun shone down harsh, turning land into desert. Her tears flooded the Nile, and she sought revenge in her rage. With her magic, she brought Osiris briefly back to life and begot Horus, whom she turned into a warrior as he grew, who went forth and killed Seth. Interestingly, Seth's wife Nephthys is the god of grief. Now, next to the Greeks, Iliad of Homer, where Achilles, his favorite friend and companion Patroclus, is killed and totally lost. Achilles doesn't know what to do. He goes and beheads 12 youth, Trojan youth prisoners, a wrong thing to do. But then he had lost his moorings. Yes, that is the famous painting from the school of David. Closer home in Ramayana, when Bharat comes back and tells Dasharath that Ram is not coming back, he takes to the bed in his grief, wastes away, and dies. Ram is not without his grief when Sita is abducted, and he rages at Lakshman for being callous and careless. Ram, the Maryada Purushottam, he loses his moorings and participates in the unseemly killing of Bali soon after. Nobody talks about the grief of the parents of Shravan Kumar after he is killed. Nobody talks about the grief of Devaki in Mahabharata, who has lost her 7 children and is not allowed to bring up her surviving one. Yes, the grief of Dhritarashtra is well known. Sanjay every day is telling him, today so many more of your sons have died on the battlefield, and the next day some more and more, till when Duryodhan dies and the grief is overwhelming. Dhritarashtra decides to crush Bhim when he comes to meet him. Krishna, the all-knowing one, replaces Bhima with an iron statue with which is crushed by Dhritarashtra in his embrace. And there is Gandhari cursing Krishna in her grief, saying that all the generations of Yadavas shall perish. The Yaduvangsh shall be no more. And there is a different grief of Dronacharya, who is tricked by Yudhishthira with Ashwathama Hato, and he sits down suddenly silent in the midst of the battlefield, having lost the reason of his being. Drishtadumna then beheads him to avenge his father Drupad. There are the 5 griefs of Yudhishthir. Yudhishthir, 30 days after the war, 13 days, the funerals are over, 30 days have gone by, and yet he is not assuming kingship. Hastinapur is without a king. What was the point of victory, he asks, when all my cousins lay dead? Many of them I have killed myself. The second grief of Yudhishthir is the death of his brother Karna, for which his mother castigates him. The third grief is the grief of all the Pandav Putras killed by Ashwathama. The fourth grief of Yudhishthir is the grief that he can no longer look Draupadi in the eye, for he, ensnared by his gambling habit, has lost her and her respect. And the fifth grief, on the path of Mahaprasthan, losing everybody one by one till he is left alone with the dog. Back to the Greeks and Electra. Grief changes people in different ways. Orestes, Sophocles' brother, becomes twisted and gnarled, peculiar, strange, unknowable. He's become bewilderingly cruel and bizarre. She wailed and lamented her grief so much that people avoid her, but he let pain seep silently into the very core of his being, and people now avoid him for his chilling silence. How must we grieve? Toni Morrison says, the body must move and throw itself about, the eyes must roll, the hands must have no peace, and the throat should release all yearning, despair, and outrage that accompany the stupidity of loss. That is one cultural construct. When all the authors of grief have been genuflected too, there is still Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who gave us the stages of grief. Updike writes of rabbit who refuses to mourn the death of his infant daughter. Eugene O'Neill talks about the Tyrone family, which does not mention their dead infant son and brother. They ignore their mother's obvious grief and subsequent morphine addiction. Emily Dickinson's Hope is a Thing with Feathers is parodied here by Max Porter, who's angry that everybody is asking him to move on. Moving on as a concept is for stupid people, because any sensible person knows that grief is a long-term project, he says. Yes, we know this poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson. But in this poem, he goes from denial, believing where we cannot prove, to acceptance. Ring out the old, ring in the new. Ring happy bells across the snow. The year is going, let him go. When he mourns the death of Alfred Henry Hallam, his friend who died 23 years old of brain hemorrhage. So is there a prescribed duration of grief? Pitru Shokam Shanmasam Matru Shokam Ekamaham Bharya Shokam Punarbharya Putra Shokam Nirantaram. Grief of losing a father, 6 months. Of the mother, a year. Grief of losing a wife lasts till the new one comes. That's a bit chauvinistic, I thought. The grief of losing a child is without an end. Ghalib, Dr. Vinay Kumar already alluded to, had seen all shades of grief. कैद हयात और बंद गम असल में दोनों एक हैं. मौत से पहले आदमी गम से निजात पाए क्यों? The prison of life and the bondage of grief are one and the same. Before the onset of death, how can a man expect to be free of grief? But elsewhere, perhaps tired of his grief, he says, Guzar jayega ye daur bhi galib, this too shall pass. Zara itminan to rakh, have some patience. Khushi hi na ठहरी तो गम की क्या औकात है? If happiness did not last, what is the power of grief? But it is perhaps his so-called student, shackled, manacled, and fettered in a stone cell in Mandalay, far away from his land, having lost his empire, seeing his son beheaded in front of his eyes, who laments and becomes the poet of grief. ना किसी की आंख का नूर हूं, ना किसी के दिल का करार हूं, जो किसी के काम ना आ सके, मैं वो एक मुश्त गुबार हूं. I am no light of anyone's eyes, nor the calm of any heart. I couldn't be of use to anyone. I am but a handful of dust. सुबह के तख्त नशीन शाम को मुजरिम ठहरे. He who sat on a throne in the morning was declared a criminal by the evening. हमने पल भर में तकदीरों को बदलते देखा. I saw fate changed overnight. Can grief be political? Hajar Churashir Ma of Mahashita Devi. The grief of the mother of a serial number of a dead body in a morgue. An exploration of fault lines in the time of Naxalite violence. Shredding of the facade of normalcy of the middle class. Upturning Foucault's order of things. What is the meaning of personal loss amidst large-scale killing and state violence? Vibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay wrote Pother Pachali in 1935, which was immortalized by Ray, Satyajit Ray, in film in 1955. The grief of the passing of the grandmother Indu Thakurain is accepted by the family and the village of Nishchintapur. But when the adolescent and ebullient and cheerful Durga is struck by illness and then swiftly dies, that breaks the family apart. Their rural idyll is shattered forever, and they leave Nischintapur to head out to the hubris of Banaras. Death, you are a poem. I have been promised by a poem that we shall meet. As the pulse ebbs and pain starts to fall asleep, not yet dark nor bright, neither midnight nor day, this is my attempt at translation. Now imagine it said out by the powerful voice of Amitabh Bachchan. मौत तू एक कविता है, मुझसे एक कविता का वादा है, मिलेगी मुझको डूबती नब्जों में जब दर्द को नींद आने लगे, जर्द सा चेहरा लिए चांद उफक तक पहुंचे, दिन अभी पानी में हो, रात किनारे के करीब, ना अंधेरा हो ना उजाला हो, ना आधी रात न दिन, जब जिस्म जब खत्म हो और रूह को सांस आए, मुझसे एक कविता का वादा है, मिलेगी मुझको. Sampuran Singh Kalra, whom we better know as Gulzar, the movie Anand, the popular face of grief. Anna Karenina has perhaps the best opening lines. Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Where we explore Anna's grief at what could not be, her guilt and sense of being rejected, her descent into despair and morphine addiction, and finally throwing herself under the train. Can grief be beautiful? Can grief be lyrical? It finds rhythm and ingenious rhyme in Yevgeny Onegin of Alexander Pushkin. This one novel in verse made my learning Russian in my misspent youth worth it. It is absolutely incredible and I recommend it to everyone. Can grief be funny? Freddie experienced the sort of abysmal soul sadness which afflicts one of Tolstoy's Russian peasants when, after putting in a heavy day's work strangling his father, beating his wife, and dropping the baby into the city's reservoir, he turns to the cupboards only to find the vodka bottle empty. So said P.G. Woodhouse. Can grief become a habit? अब ये भी नहीं ठीक कि हर दर्द मिटा दें, कुछ दर्द कलेजे से लगाने के लिए है. ये इल्म का सौदा, ये रिसाले, ये किताबें एक शख्स के यादों को भुलाने के लिए हैं. Novelists make up things, take flights of fancy, but when writers write about their own felt grief, it is deeply personal, it is precise and particular. Didion, she wrote after her husband died in a year of magical thinking. I could not count the times during the average day when something would come up that I needed to tell him. This impulse did not end with his death. What ended was the possibility of response. And when later her daughter died and she wrote Blue Nights, she says, it's a place none of us know until we reach it. That is grief. Some of you have recognized The Lion of Narnia. Yes, there is C.S. Lewis, who wrote after his wife died about the all-pervasiveness of grief. Her absence was like the sky, spread over everything. Her loss pervaded every waking moment. In a grief observed, he wrote of something which very few write about, that is embarrassment. Daniel Day-Lewis, the actor, his son, I cannot talk to the children about her. The moment I try, there appears on their faces neither grief, nor love, nor fear, nor pity, but the fatal of non-conductors, embarrassment. They look at me as if I were committing an indecency. Nadine Gordimer, in her last book, soon after her husband died, she writes, Did you come back last night? I try to dream you into materialization, but you don't appear. And she ends, I sat at the table. You didn't turn up too late. You will not come. Never. Acceptance. She died soon after. How does it feel? Julian Barnes says, after the death of his wife, as if you have been dropped from a height of several thousand feet, conscious all the time, have landed feet first in a rose bed with an impact that has driven you in up to your knees, and whose shock has caused your internal organs to rupture and burst forth from your body. That is the pain of grief. Freud, in mourning, it is as the world which has become poor and empty. In melancholia, it is the ego itself. Sigmund Freud talks about the time and mental labor to revive oneself, to relieve oneself, to relive memories, and to release the dead, to let them go. Erich Fromm, again a psychiatrist, described Western society as a death-defying culture. This is happening around the time of the Second World War, so you will understand the context. He controversially said, increase in violence in society today is directly related to our inability to grieve. We have heard by the previous speaker about bibliotherapy. Is it effective? Yes, anecdotal articles say so, but there are yet no systematic reviews or meta-analysis. Maybe it is incumbent on us, the psychiatrists who are interested in the business of literature, to come out with something more definitive in this regard. I ask sometimes my patients to write, and one of my patients wrote this 3 weeks ago. She had lost her husband to suicide some years ago. She is not yet 30. And I shared this with her explicit permission. This is what she wrote. I want to feel the warmth of love that is lost. I want to feel the taste of a sumptuous meal. I want to enjoy the colors of the sky. I want to touch the breeze kissing me every time. And I want all these to mask the memory of the feel of your skin, your hair, the special taste of food when you fed me. But all I can feel is emptiness, and all I can be is just a weeping widow. So I end, hopefully on time, saying that a whole lot I have not covered because of constraints and because of ignorance. I have presented a world and chaotic structure, much like grief itself. And I have not shed too much light on mental health because I am addressing largely a body of psychiatrists. I'm incredibly grateful to my friend Dr. Ajit Bhide, who gave me this opportunity to view literature once again in greater detail than I usually do, away from the gibberish that we sometimes read in the review of literature. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your very exhaustive overview of literature about grief. And it was very interesting nuggets from historical perspective of various authors' perception about grief. Now the topic is open for discussion, comments, and additions.
So there are few comments in the chat box.
Yeah. See, most of them are observations.
So well presented, Kaushik sir. So well
Yeah.
presented. It's positive. I think Sylvia Plath told earlier, dying is an art and I do it exceptionally well.
I
So grief can be presented so exceptionally in well fashion. We all are mesmerized. We are recording it, and it will be the whole seminar will be uploaded to infotainment website of Indian Psychiatric Society. A new thing which had been created this year.
thank you very much. I tried to avoid some of the very well-known ones. Sylvia Plath, of course. Being all of us being doctors, all of us, me being in the armed forces, we get to see unexpected death sometimes up close, and it raises so many questions and takes us to so many parts which are already charted. I think Dr. Ajit Bhide has a question.
Ajit?
Not quite a question, just a comment. I was so happy to see Tennyson over there. I thought you would also mention overcoming grief, the counters to grief.
No.
She knows swoon hearted, cry, all the maidens watching said.
It's all maidens watching. Yes.
And then rose a nurse of 90 years, placed her child upon her knee. Like
Mm.
summer tempest came her tears, sweet my child, I live for thee. So the undoing of grief when you have something positive to look forward to. Of course, I'm sure
Actions.
Anamika will be covering the positivity angle. But
Yeah.
I think that is a very telling poem for me. I use it very often, especially while dealing with bereavement, especially untimely bereavement.
Absolutely. Grief. The reading about grief doesn't make us grieve.
I particularly like your foray through the epics and the different examples of grief that are there. It's very interesting that Lord Krishna tells Arjuna not to grieve and not to be, well, he uses crude terminology, but not to be a funk in the face of all this. And the same Pandavas are eventually
left grieving.
No, through devices that are not quite ethical, impose grief on others, including Dhritarashtra.
True.
The very act of writing about loss and grief itself can be therapeutic.
Yes.
The greatest example is the book written by John Gunther in 1947. The title of the book is derived from a poem by John Donne. And when this book was published, it opened up avenues, especially in US, of people to talk openly about loss and grief. And it is a very beautiful, poignant memoir of coming to terms with his son's illness and loss. I would suggest all of you to have a copy of that and read it. Any other comments and observations?
I also wanted to talk about Kurt Vonnegut's grief about his son, about a whole lot of war poetry, more so after the First World War, some about the Second, but time is a constraint.
A quote, famous quote is, I remember, when you are in grief or when you are in deep pain, you can do both the things. You can cry or you can laugh. I prefer laughter because you have to do the less amount of cleaning in your life after that. The kind of sublime feeling he has expressed.
Grieve and you grieve alone, laugh and you share it with others.
One question from Parvati Krishnan. It was like a journey through grief, lulled by your soothing voice. Thank you, sir. I wanted to know if you could address the issue of non-bereavement of grief. That is a societal or cultural pressure of loss being thrust on individual who did not feel like bereaving.
Thank you for mentioning that. The bottling of grief in various contexts, not just in societal pressure, but also in the terms of machismo and so many other things, has been addressed extensively in literature. It has been addressed in biographies as well, some of which are so well written that they are themselves works of art. I would urge you to read the biography of Patton, the general, where his grief at losing his troops, people dying in front of his eyes, how he puts on this false face and tries to not show grief. That is just but one example. There are many.
If there are no further comments and observations or questions, we move on to the next speaker. And I request Vinay to introduce the speaker. You have to unmute, Vinay. Unmute.
Yes, I'm doing that. It's my pleasure to introduce Prof. Anamika. Anamika ji and myself both are very we share friendship for more than 3 decades, definitely. In 80s, we met for the first time when both of us were participating in youth festival organized by government of Bihar and placed by Patna University Science College. And from there, our ways separated. I entered in medical discipline and Anamika ji entered in the field of literature, and gradually she grew to the level that now she is Academy Award winning author. And Academy Award was basically controversial for several years, but when it went to Professor Anamika, from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, in one voice, everybody said that it's great, befitting, most suitable. So such is the acceptance of Anamika ji in entire country across languages. And she bridges in Indian literature, especially when we talk about Hindi literature, there is not much communication with other languages. But Anamika ji is bridging the gap between English and Hindi literature. The brief introduction is here, which I would like to read. A contemporary Indian poet, social worker, novelist, writing in Hindi and critic writing in English. Professor in college at Delhi University, where she teaches literature in English. She has published articles on gray areas of indigenous literature, gender studies, and contemporary poetry. Both her discursive essays and poems are inscribed at different national and international universities. Besides poetry, she has written novels and books on feminist poetics, poetry in conflict zone, care ethics, and treatment of love and death in post-war women poets. When I was interviewing Anamika ji and I asked why you shifted to writing a novel, she said that it's not possible to write everything in poetry. And lots of memories, lots of learnings, lots of cultural things are lying in your unconscious, which are kind of burden to you, which are painful to you, which reminds you that these things have to be taken out. So to negotiate with all those memories and experiences, I entered in the field of novel, and she has, till date, to the best of my knowledge, 4 novels are already published. As I mentioned earlier, she received Sahitya Academy Award in 2020 for collection Tokri Mein Digan. And Tokri Mein Digan, it's unique collection. I do not know whether it has been translated in English. Otherwise, those who can read Hindi, I invite everybody to get this book, Tokri Mein Digan. This has been published by Rajkamal Prakashan, the leading publishers of Hindi. And other poems are Anushtup, her first book. The first chand in which poetry was written by Valmiki was Anushtup, and the first book of Anamika is also Anushtup. Then Khurdari Hatiniya, Dubhan, Pani Ko Sab Yaad Tha, Pani ko sab yaad tha, and my book actually both were released in the same session in book fair, International Book Fair, Delhi. A very pleasant memory. Then Band Rasto Ka Safar. Her poetry has been translated across different languages, in entire India, and different languages: Malayalam, Marathi, Bangla, Punjabi, Odia, Kannada, Korean, Russian, English. Her English, the translated collection of poems in English is My Typewriter is My Piano. And these days, she's doing good service to literature by publishing bilingual journal for Shanti. And also she organizes lots of programs with young poets and young writers, and that is very encouraging. So it's a great thing for me that we are friends. So with these few words, I invite Prof. Anamika to share her thoughts for the day.
Thank you so much, Vinay ji, and the Board of Scholars who invited me here. Can you hear me? Is it?
Ma'am,
Is
can
it
you adjust
audible?
the camera
Yes.
so that you come in the center slightly?
Okay.
Yes, fine.
Is it okay?
Yes, ma'am, fine.
Hello. Is it okay now?
It's okay.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, fine.
So I begin by thanking you all for this great opportunity to learn and share my own thoughts. You've already had a perspective, a reader's and a doctor's perspective on dealing with victimhood, guilt, loss. I think in the span of 20 minutes, I can only cover, or 25 minutes, I can cover the author's perspective and tell you how an author is different from other motivational speakers. And what is it? You know, Prabhaji, when she was speaking, she mentioned three things. She said it's the identification and the emotional security and the whole connect that helps you in this transition from victimhood or guilt or loss to the state of grace. Let's sum it up like that, because grace is a very inclusive a term, both in Indian culture and in the West. So this transition, although we know and we say, we've had numerous examples. When he was talking, the previous scholar, I had a feeling that butterflies are flying, or, you know, the sky is replete with butterflies. So many illustrations in one go. I mean, such sights are rare now, at least in India. In Africa, we have big butterflies flying across the sky all in one go sometimes. So when all these illustrations with beautiful wings were fluttering in the sky, I thought I'll not give you many examples, because it's already proven that, you know, this helps. Reading and writing helps. And how exactly does it help? I think I'll be talking basically about it. This is what I decided. When I already heard the two presentations, I thought I'll leave other things that I had in mind. And I'll basically, there is one thing that I want to be very clear about, that a writer is a weakling. He is as weak, as fragile in his moments of suffering as the reader who is trying to read him for some moments of inspirational journey or transition. How does it work then? From the whole, you know, there is a word in Tantra called yantra. In Buddhist philosophy, we call it mandala. That's a kind of consecrated space which is supposed to present in microcosm or mirror in the microcosm the ruling forces of harmony in the macrocosm, in the world around you. When Derrida says every text has a mystical interior, and you need to read the text against the text to get at that aporia. This is what he means. I mean, we can build a cultural parallel by treating a poem or a short story like a mandala. Now, by way of structuring your inner chaos, you can actually create conditions which can let the seeds of Buddhahood or Sthitapragyata or greater wisdom, call it what you want to, first in you, and then in the person you're addressing. Writing is like whistling in the dark. You whistle just to fight your own loneliness and grief and boredom. And suddenly you discover that somebody has joined you in the act of whistling. And that's that chorus of the whole idea of joining hands together. The loneliness of the reader, joining hands with the loneliness of the writer. That creates the magic. Hand-holding creates the magic. Book is a consecrated space in the sense that it generates that realm, the twilight zone. Somehow, mystically, I think, part of it is mystical, part of it could be scientific. If you think about science, it creates a kind of diversion. If you think about philosophy, it creates a kind of twilight zone or shunyata or sthitapragyata. As your mind swings from one end of the binary to the other, maybe from sorrow to happiness, or this is non-stop. You never reach your moment of peace or bliss of whatever you call it, negative or positive state. Only when for some time the pendulum stops in the middle, in the state of sthitapragyata or samyak drishti, you realize that, there's a kind of surrender that happens. You happen to, in that moment of surrender, what happens has been best summarized by Kabir, and he says, जल में कुंभ, कुंभ में जल है, बाहर भीतर पानी, फुटा कुंभ जल जल ही समाना, यह तत्कथो ज्ञानी. Only when the ego boundaries of your narrow ego shatters and the water within becomes one with the water without. The drop becomes one with the larger ocean. In that moment of chitta vistar, as it is called in Indian philosophy, in that moment of chitta vistar, you realize the oneness of being. You understand, oh my God, the world is like an interconnected web. Any kind of spandana at one end will definitely go, spread all over. So environment and the self. There is a disconnect first, and then a greater realization in the moment of pratyabhigya, awakening of the self, awakening of the deeper memory, that you realize that we're one, all one. There is no individual suffering, no individual grief. It's just a state of tallinata. I mean, I'm not saying that authors have this vision as a permanent state of mind. No, it comes and goes. It stays only like a lightning, flash of lightning. You are aware at the peak of your own grief, dealing with your own depressions. You're suddenly aware for a moment, and there, what does lightning do? It doesn't really give you a ray or a torch to walk with. It makes you aware of the fact in the first go that the darkness is deep. It makes you aware of the deepness of dark forces. And only then you surrender, and then comes the individual moment of individual awakening, which generally gradually gets transformed in some kind of a collective, or maybe I don't call it collective, unless you are like a Greek, in a Greek drama, it's collective when a chorus reads things aloud. Otherwise, it's not collective, it's one-to-one. So what am I trying to say? I'm just trying to say that, in short stories, novels, or poems, writers are actually building the kind of lean-to houses or small sheds where they shelter their thoughts and half-thoughts. And as they start doing that, something happens. And that is the point of identification, I suppose, that grants you the emotional security when you pick up literature. You understand, okay, this is not a motivational speaker. No. He's a person like me. In Sanskrit poetics, we have a word for this. We call it identification. We call it actually, the Hindi word for it, or the Sanskrit word for it, is sadharanikaran. Now, in the moments of therapeutic release, now how to come to that moment of therapeutic release? When you begin your poem, why do you do it? You understand that this is when everybody is experienced, that when you write, when you speak in this world, in this lonely world, when you do not have people to speak to, and you do not even have the money to pay to the psychotherapist, and you do not have many friends to look up to, on whose shoulder you could cry, what do you do in the lonely corner of your room? You write. And you talk to yourself. That's a dialogue with your own self. And it could be called therapeutic in the sense spitting or vomiting can be therapeutic. In the first draft, it is almost like that. It's almost like that. You would all remember Raja Udayan in our classical tales. We have 64 kinds of 64 kalaएं होती हैं. There are 64 kinds of art forms in Indian aesthetics. And you would be amused to know, or maybe you know it already, that Chaur Kala is also a kala, the art of stealing. And then the art of spitting, that's also an art. Raja Udayan, when he did spit the pan juice out on the mural, on the wall, he created a structure out there. Sometimes it became a peacock, sometimes it became a lion. In Shudrak's play, Mritchakatika, there is an unemployed, it's an Andhed Nagri, so brilliant people do not necessarily gain employment there. So they become thieves. Now, because he's a scholarly thief, when he creates a hole in the mud house, he does it in a way that it becomes sometimes an elephant, sometimes a horse. I suppose writing is like that. There is an art in spitting. Only when you master the art, who says this? Elizabeth Bishop says that the art of losing is not hard to master. When she says it, and all the confessionals say it, she actually knows how difficult the art of to master the art of the loss is. This is a difficult art. Dying is an art, as Professor Vinay said just now. Sylvia talked with Platt was talking about the art of dying. But for it to become an art, you have to have some kind of a surrender, some kind of a realization, pratyabhigya, some kind of linking up with the wider facts of life. Like, we have, when we think about positivity and we know about the connect between the environment and the self, we understand that there have been basically two kinds of peace theories ruling the world. In the West, there have been disillusionments, and the disillusionment that the Western peace theory offers us is at this point that, it says that when you set the structure right, the inner chaos of the individual will definitely be addressed. And in the Eastern peace theory, in Gandhi's peace theory, for instance, Western peace theory, let's take up Marx. He says, structure, get the outer structure right, and the inner structure will be all right. It will fall in place. But Eastern peace theory, what does he say? Okay, if you work on your individual self, on your own hamartia, Buddha says, Gandhi says, and most of us, our philosophers say, if you have seeds of devatva and seeds of Buddhahood in you, if you address that, some hamartia, and there is also some ounce of hamartia, tragic flaw. If you address that hamartia, that tragic flaw ruling your own conduct, then somehow mystically, because the environment and the self are interconnected, some beautiful, the seeds of Buddhahood within you will blossom. So I see a disconnect there also. No, structures should be set right. After all, hunger, war, politics of humiliations that women and Dalits and Adivasis and all the marginalized sections of our society, the poor, destitutes, and the people in all the conflict zones, the kinds of sufferings they have are, the kinds of depressions and negativities that they are facing is nothing to do with their own doing. It's related to the wider causes. So, and you've seen it in the cases of the failure of French Revolution and Russian Revolution, that setting the structure right also can be counterproductive. It can, any moment of brilliant revolution can turn into counter-revolution within years if you do not work on your inner self. So somehow working on the inner self and working on the outer environment is something that joins hands. We can, and language is a kind of Leela Bhumi, or a play field, and also a Yuddha Bhumi, where identities all over the world are trying to set things right. But in a way, as Emily Dickinson says, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. So this slantness is something that turns any kind of therapeutic release into a piece of art. And this slantness comes with the kind of common suffering that even an author faces. And if it's genuine in admitting it, nowadays, all kinds of non-fiction books are doing well, biographies are doing well, and the books that the previous speaker was referring to were mostly confessional, where people lead by giving their own examples. So this kind of a humility which comes with surrender is something that we must understand. And then I can also think about many examples. Like, somebody mentioned John Donne. There's a poet called George Herbert who says, contemporary, he was a very good friend of John Donne's mother. He was senior to, John Donne. And he's written a beautiful poem called Puli, where this Puli is an example. You are all scientists, you know it already. It's the example of first class lever. And it helps you, you go on pulling yours at the one end of the rope, and somehow you're released of the burden. Your burden goes high up there. So he says that the ripening restlessness, God gave you everything, he writes. He's a 16th century mystical poet. Naturally, God comes to is the part of his common parlance. So he says, God gave you everything, and then he gave you ripening restlessness. Why? Because it had to be put to use. It would help you transcend. Our own Ageya says, Dukkha sabko manchta hai. Every point of suffering, every kind of challenge is also an opportunity. The text generates a kind of Leela where you could see for yourself creates all kinds of characters, all kinds of, what to say? I mean, heteroglossia, to give you if there are technical people who know literature would know, all kinds of dialogues, all kinds of chit-chats on the dhaba, in the metro, at the village panchayat, in the waiting rooms of the doctors like you, at the different gyms and beauty parlors. Beauty parlors, again, are a great center for women releasing their pressures, going there for some kind of a therapeutic release. All these chit-chats over the space, somehow find a place in that Leela Bhumi of literature. And you realize the beauty of it is that you realize through these characters and through these, intertexts, to use another word, from Barth and Julia Kristeva. What is intertext? The intertexts that find a place in literature which keep floating in the textual subconscious. Not only do we have our subconscious and the unconscious, we know that the text also has a subconscious, linguistic subconscious, and also the unconscious. So we have things falling, all kinds of things from the racial memory and the, chit chats around us, film songs, whatever, pouring in, whatever we read, and the kinds of texts that you mentioned, or both of you, both the previous speakers, quoted and gave you so many examples. Why the intertext actually sink into your subconscious and start like an eel fish. They fight, going against each other. Now, the point here is that as you read this, or you get into this state of mind that the author was in, and this creates the point of identification, and this creates the point of comfort. This creates the kind of comfort zone. Now that gives you the higher state of mind. Now, how I've used two texts, small poems, to see how it works. How, in case of poetry, I'll give you my own examples, maybe, because I've seen these two little poems working, doing some little things for the people around me, the women that are suffering in all kinds of situations. The first text is called Darwaza. This is one example of how the suffering is translated into a kind of vantage point, and how it becomes opportunity, like a pulley. It pulls you up, helps you in transcend. And its poem says, मैं एक दरवाजा थी, मुझे जितना पीटा गया, मैं उतना खुलती गई। भीतर आने वाले तो देखा, चल रहा है एक बृहद चक्र, चक्की रुकती है तो चरखा चलता है, चरखा रुकता है तो चलती है कैंची सुई, गरज यह कि चलता ही रहता है अनवरत कुछ कुछ, और अंत में सब पर चल जाती है झाड़ू। तारे बुहारती हुई पहाड़, वृक्ष, पत्थर, सृष्टि के सब टूटे बिखरे पत्रे जो एक टोकरी में जमा करती जाती है मन की दुछत्ती पर। Another small poem. I think everybody understands this bit of English, and if the translation is needed, I can send it to you later on. This is a bite from a longer poem which talks about the process of creation and how it helps you sublimate. First, how you sublimate as a writer, and then how it works on the psyche of the person. This poem I had read aloud in a jhuggi cluster, where all kinds of seamstresses, small darjine, in jhuggi clusters who are experts at the art of mending clothes. I read it aloud there, and I think that really they felt identified, and I could see the smile, face radiant with smile because of the sense of identification. When I said, जो बातें मुझको चुभ जाती हैं, मैं उनकी सुई बना लेती हूँ। चुभी हुई बातों की ही सुई से मैंने ताके हैं फूल सभी धरती पर, हरे भरे सारे नजारे, आसमान के ये सितारे, मुझसे ही टकवाए थे उस खुदा ने, मेरा पुराना मेहरबान है वो खुदा, सच पूछिए तो है मेरा इकलौता आशिक वही, बाकी तो सब बाल बुतरू है, मैं उनकी चिल्लपों कान नहीं धरती, रहती हूँ मस्त और किसी से नहीं डरती. This was again wife bashing and many other tortures in the Nizamuddin Basti where I went, and this general, I'm sorry to say this about myself, but this is something beyond me actually. The text is an independent thing. This healed and this empowered the people who were disempowered, who had nowhere to go and nothing to spend. somebody had asked a question in the response to the first presentation, how a person who's not literate can receive the dhvani. Of course, when there is something in the act of reading aloud, when you read poems aloud, the same kind of generative force, the same kind of dhvani. Any text is like a Rudra Veena. There are so many sleeping notes in it. This is what Anandvardhan calls dhvani, and Juliet Kirsteva calls intertext. There's so many intertexts sleeping in it. When you read it aloud, all by yourself, or with the people around you who are, suffering some kind of a victimhood or some kind of a guilt. I've done this exercise even in jails, Tihar jails. There were all kinds of people there, all kinds of murderers were there. But there was something, I didn't really recite my own poems because I carefully chose poetry where, I won't be able to talk about it in the last small sprint, but there I could see that people who started writing poetry after that, a brief session, and they were made to write poetry, they felt, some kind of a burden going off their head. When I went there for the second time, they all showed me something. And that had some therapy. About this, you've already talked. I did not mention that anything in great detail. I don't know how much time I have, but I'll sum up by saying that it basically ends up in the act of give and take. There is only point of liberation or mukti is to realize that you are not the lone sufferer, and you can go across, you can cross your river, turbulent river, only by helping people cross the bridge, cross the river, cross their sinking boats. If you help people in mending their boats, somehow you also, or help them get across, you also get across. So this is a mystical realization that comes to you only when you handhold in poetry. And this give and take reminds me of two major poets, Jayadev in Gita Govindam, where you see Radha dressed up like Krishna and Krishna dressed up like Radha after that great Ras. So readers and writers, they end up cross-dressing. And Amir Khusro, the great Sufi poet, gives a brilliant metaphor for civilizational dialogue. Any kind of dialogue helps, but civilizational dialogue, he says, and imagine two cultures looking deep into each other's eye when I read this. छाप तिलक सब छीनी रे मुझसे नैना मिला के अपने ही रंग लीनी रे मुझसे नैना मिला के. When other cultures, alien cultures came to India, and they seemed to be snatching away all that we had. No, I mean, it was something that also added to our culture. It was a very friendly act of leela, like two children fight. When the two children fight, they fight for some time and then they hug each other. And I have seen this happening, that the tear of one little child will fall on the cheek of the other child. No, they fight and they hug each other and sleep together with one tear from one drop of tear falling on the other person's cheek. No, literally transactions are like that. And this is not only something that you can explain. There is something that happens when your ego boundaries somehow expand or shatter. So this is what I wanted to tell you. I think the time is over. So let's have discussions if possible.
I request Prof. R. Raguram sir to comment, and then others will join.
It was a pleasure to listen to the poetess. She took us on a journey based on her own perspective, based on her own perception of her life, as reflected through her poetry. It was, as I said, it was such a pleasure to listen to her. Thank you, Vinay, for bringing her over to this program.
Dr. Ajit Bhide, sir.
I was mesmerized by the analogy of the pinpricks of life being converted into creative needles for embroidery. I think that was a very telling poem. I'm glad that Vinay has introduced us, Anamika. I hope we will interact a lot more. And you did great justice to the brief given to you. In that particular poem, I relished that this is how you can convert your angst into something, you can sublimate it into something which is much higher. I also cannot help but quote something which is actually attributable to Byron, but it's from Shelley when he says, "Most wretched men are cradled into poetry by wrong. They learn in suffering what they teach in song." So poetry is an act of sublimation. Actually, these were words of Byron converted by Shelley into a poem. I forget the exact name of the poem. Julian and Madallo, when they were going past a lunatic asylum in Venice, Byron made this observation when they heard shrieks. But thank you very much for doing justice to the brief given to you, and we look forward to more interaction with you. Please don't call us scholars. We are doctors, you are the scholar.
No. It was such a moving moment, interacting with you, really. And you're also well read. I had tears, my eyes were moist with tears when I heard you quoting extensively from world literature. It's a moment of real gratitude.
Shubrata, kindly go through chats. Do you have any question or?
The comments by Prabha ma'am. Ma'am, would you like to tell yourself?
Prabhaji, kindly share, please.
Yeah, I was just saying, and Anamika ji, you really took us on a journey, and the metaphors that you used, especially wo sui wala jo metaphor tha, like I would echo what Dr. Ajit says, that it was something so evocative and so meaningful. And then about the joining of the reader and the writer and the cultures, और जो आंसू के बारे में बोला आपने, मतलब these are things that we will never think of. It's only a poetess who will think of these metaphors, but they are so meaningful. And thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
I particularly like the analogy she mentioned about when two cultures come together. These days it's viewed as clash of civilizations. But the analogy she used is two children playing. Right? It was so insightful. That initially there is confrontation, but later there is joy and assimilation.
But many people don't understand this.
Pardon?
Many people don't understand this, especially political people. That's the problem.
I too would like to say a few words.
Yes, Dr.
We got a different perspective compared to the other two talks, because from the creator herself, the process of creation and various metaphors, we got it. That is a very interesting aspect. The second thing is to compare what she mentioned as the reader and the writer coming together, like Krishna and Radha cross-dressing in the Gita Govind. It is a very good example. So what happens in a therapeutic setting where the therapist and the patient, they make a pact together and journey the process of recovery. So that is almost like that. It's a parallel to what is happening in the psychotherapeutic process. So thank you very much for that insight.
Sir, if we are done, can we move on to the vote of
This
thanks?
talk reminds me that Freud learned a lot from literature. And without Shakespeare, we can't think of, without Dostoevsky, we can't think of Freud, having Freud, the way he emerged. So thank you, Anamika ji. And
Thank you so much. Thank you so much,
and
Vinay.
this is compelling me, this session is compelling me to announce a book, Literature and Psychiatry, Indian Perspective. And before I will be handing over my battalion to somebody else, we will decide editors and we will plan table of contents. And it will be not only a kind of from what we have read till date, but we will try to carry out some studies. Actually, I had tried to reach Sahitya Academy for a kind of study that IPS, Indian Psychiatric Society, will give you a psychiatrist, you give a writer or a person who writes criticism, and there will be a combo, and then we will study 14 languages in this context.
But that's very good, nice.
But
very
there was no response. I think I must go to Sahitya Academy with Anamika ji to make them understand. Otherwise, they will not understand.
I'll go. I'll definitely I'll come along.
Before January, we will announce editors, and editors are here in this session only. So
right. Yes, it's such
a brilliant
session.
Dr. Ajit
Brilliant session.
Our editor, Dr. Ajit Bhide, is one of my mentors in IPS. I was general secretary and he was my president, and I learned a lot from him, including English. So, and English literature as well. In every meeting, we used to sit together for hours. Everything is over in the night for 2-3 hours, and I used to listen to him. So this is the background, and our book will we will take 1 or 2 year time. We are not in a hurry, but book will be announced this year. Editors will be fixed.
And it's a good idea to involve the IPS in this, but we can do it independently of that as well. But interesting you brought up Freud, because I remember in an interview, Freud said, I did not discover the unconscious. It was poets who discovered the unconscious.
Yes.
That's a very remarkable observation of his, not made by anybody else before or after, as far as I know. Shubrata, before we hand over for the vote of thanks, may I share an anonymous poem over here?
ठीक है, दे दीजिए.
हमें लगा अनामिका जी आप अपने कह रहे हैं, दे देंगे. Saved by a story, modern or hoary, the poet's lines, gross or sublime, rescued my soul from falling further in misery's hole that I thought had no end. I will now choose to expend my energy, my time, my emotion into some worthy creation, worthy for my mind, my being, teaching me a new way of seeing. It might help or rescue another, and the game should go on further. This is from a patient of mine who was here earlier. His name is Kogan Param. So I think that covered all the 3 presentations quite well. Thanks to everybody, but for a formal vote of thanks, may I invite our IPS Executive Committee Observer. I'm sorry, Shubrata, this is your...
No, that's fine, sir.
It's for you to do it.
Our EC coordinator, ever energetic, encouraging Dr. Ruma Bhattacharya.
যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে, তবে একলা চলো একলা চলো একলা চলো রে, যদি কেউ কথা না কয় ওরে ও অভাগা কেউ কথা না কয়, সবাই থাকে মুখ ফেরায় সবাই করে ভয়, তবে পরাণ খুলে ও তুই মুখ ফুটে তোর মনের কথা একলা বলো রে. This has always helped me, overcome times of difficulty, challenges. Gratitude is my word for this online symposium, Mindful Pages. And this is the best webinar I have ever attended. I did not want it to end. So from the task force, Mental Health and Literature, I would like to thank our chairpersons, Dr. R. Raguram, our own Dr. Vinay Kumar, the speakers, Professor Prabhachandra on impact of literature on mental health, Dr. Kaushik Chatterjee from Shllong, grief, literature and mental health, and of course, Professor Anamika from New Delhi, literature for inducing and enhancing positivity. I would also like to thank our office bearers, ever smiling our president, Dr. Vinay Kumar, Dr. Laxmikanth Rathi, Dr. Brahma, Dr. Aleem Siddique, and Dr. O.P. Singh, and of course the task force, Mental Health and Literature Task Force. Advisor is the evergreen Dr. Ajit, Bhide sir, and of course we miss the chairperson, Dr. Anand Nadkarni, co-chair Dr. T M Raghuram, and the brilliant convener, Dr. Shubrata, without whom this wouldn't have been possible. I would also like to thank Sun Pharma, Mr. Purushottam and his team. And of course, all the participants who could take time out on a relaxed Sunday listening to this. I mean, this was amazing. Gratitude is all I have to say. I look forward to many more. And like Dr. Vinay Kumar was saying, like, he is thinking of bringing out books and stuff. So I'm really, really excited. And I hope this committee works more and we keep this committee running. And if not, we can run our own, group. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ruma, for proposing the vote of thanks. I would like to end this symposium with a quote by a Nobel laureate, Dr. S. Chandrasekhar, which has been taken up by RR's Facebook page wall. I would feel that an appreciation of the arts in a conscious, disciplined way might help one to do science better. Thank you, one and all. Happy Sunday.
Yeah, one thing I must tell. This morning, Ajit was whispering that, I said, how many people do you expect at 11? Ajit said 15. And I was surprised that there were more than 75 people listening through all these talks. Wonderful, wonderful.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you all.
Personal thanks to chairpersons and all the
Aravind,
speakers.
can you stop the recording?